Okay, everybody, this lesson is going to be about constructing explanations, specifically with a system model. And so the learning target is I can construct an explanation of a phenomenon using a system model. Now remember, the purpose of explanations is to be able to get out of your head what do you think and to be able to put this down on paper. And when we're using a system model, specifically, we're trying to explain these different components of a system. Remember, a system has, if you've never learned this before, or if you've ever heard this before, a system has inputs and a system has outputs. And we can see that right here, that we have some arrows going in and some arrows going out. That represents the flow or a cause or an effect. And so systems have inputs and outputs, things that are coming in and out. And these inputs and outputs interact with one another in order to keep the system either in balance or keep the system is going to change just a little bit, or the system could be moving in a certain direction, or it could be causing some sort of a phenomenon that we're seeing. And there's different components, different parts of this system that make up the system. And these different components act in relationships with one another, right? For example, if we have a deer population and we have a wolf population out in the woods, well, those are two components of an ecosystem, right? And they interact with one another. The deer run away from the wolves, and the wolves go chase down the deer and eat them. And the population of those two animals act in relationship with one another, because as we get more deer, the wolves have more food, so we have more wolves. As the deer die off, we have less food for the wolves, and so the wolves would also die off a little bit. And so that can show how the components of a system can interact with each other. And we have inputs such as the sun or the water or other animals in the ecosystem, and we have outputs, things like animals that are dying that move out of the ecosystem. And as we are watching a system, we are trying to explain how it works so that we can learn more about this system and better understand how changes to the system could affect the overall system. And so good explanations using a system model have a scientific cause. Hey, what is causing the phenomenon that we're seeing? They identify the components of the system. So I identified a deer and a wolf in that ecosystem. So what is making up this system? And we want to label those. And then using those connections between the components to explain, describe, and predict what's going to happen in the system. For example, if you saw that we introduced a new animal, like let's say we introduced bears into our ecosystem, okay, how would that change the system, the different components of that ecosystem, the deer and the wolves, right? So that would be an example of being able to predict how the components could be changed by a change in the system, and to be able to explain our system. A couple other things that we can do with system models, that we could represent them mathematically if we are doing some calculations and using some computational thinking through this. This is something that we're going to get into later in the course, but as we start using equations more in our explanations, that's where we'll be talking about mathematically. So that's what we're looking for in a system model. So as we're looking at an actual system model, this is the outline that you're going to have for your system models. This is called the what do I think. Remember, this is just about getting this ideas out of your head and to answer a question. So you're going to be picking one of the questions that you brainstormed in the question-making activity when you came up with 20 questions and evaluated those questions. And then you're gonna pick one of those. So for here, I said, how do tomato plants grow out? Because I've been thinking a lot about tomato plants lately. And then you're gonna use this space here to draw your system model. And this is gonna be showing, remember, your inputs, your outputs, the components of your system, and how they're interacting with one another. So for me, if I'm drawing a picture of my tomato plants, right, this is just an explanation based off of what I know. Let's say I draw a stem, I draw a leaf here, coming off. Apologize, I'm not an art teacher. But we've got these leaves, right? And draw one more just to get in the right spot. So let's say, what are some of the inputs and outputs of this system? Well, I know that water comes up from the ground through the roots of the plant, and it goes into the leaf. So I'm going to say that water is going to enter in this leaf. And I'm going to be looking mostly at this system right here of the leaf. What's going on in the leaf? Because I'm going to be thinking about how does the sun affect this plant. And so I can see an input would be sunlight, right? That's going to go into my system. Now I also know that outside of the leaf, there's something called carbon dioxide, or CO2, that is in the air that the leaf brings into itself in order to do photosynthesis. And so this is something that I've heard before. I know about this, and so I can use it to develop my system model. And I can come up with some other ideas. You know, if you have other things that you think or that you wonder about, remember this is kind of like our hypothesis. So now I'm going to zoom in on that little box that I had. I had my leaf right here, so we can get a little better look at it. And I'm going to draw these little things called chloroplasts in here. Right, these little chloroplasts in here. You probably heard of them before, but these little guys who are going to take the sunlight that comes in, they're going to take water, H2O, and they're going to take that carbon dioxide from the outside, and they're going to use those inputs to make glucose or sugar. Okay, glucose is a type of sugar, right? And so if we take these sugars, all of these glucose molecules, and what we're going to do is we're going to combine all those glucose. I'm just going to write them as GLC, and I'm going to combine them with each other. And this glucose here, this long chain of glucose, is what's going to actually make up the backbone of this plant, right? This is going to make a lot of the structures in our plant. It's going to allow this to contribute to growth of the plant. As we make more glucose, we're going to be able to grow more. And so what I did was I took my inputs of the sun, water, and carbon dioxide, showed them in a little bit more detailed model inside something called the chloroplast, and I should really label this. Let's see, this should be labeled as a chloroplast. And in order to show how this plant is actually going to grow. So we've got our inputs, we've got our outputs, we've got our components of our system, and we have how these inputs interact with each other. They interact inside of the chloroplast. Whoops, we moved our how do tomato plants move well. This should stay right there. Okay, so this is a very simplified system model. I'm just trying to give you a quick look at what this looks like. But it's going to, number one, show the cause of the growth, right? So the cause of the growth is photosynthesis, and I could write that down here too. This is going on through photosynthesis right here. So the cause of the plant growth is photosynthesis. I'm showing the components. I have my leaf, I have my chloroplast, I have the different inputs and outputs that are being shown here, and I'm also showing the relationships between these. Okay, so how does the sun, water, and carbon dioxide interact with each other, and what comes out of that is our glucose. And then what happens with the glucose? Right, well, the glucose is used to make these long chains, which contributes to the growth of the plant cell. And showing how those interact with each other, mostly with these arrows, is going to show our flows of components throughout our system. Okay, so I have those three components. I'm going to stop right here because I have to write out an explanation now with a one sentence about my system model. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time to type that out, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got my explanation done. I wrote out: the plant's chloroplasts combine energy from the sun, CO2, and water to form glucose, which is used to grow the plant. And that's going to give me a one-sentence explanation of what I'm thinking about this system model and the answer to the question of how do tomato plants grow well. From this explanation, I could go and I could design a test in order to test out my explanation to see if it was right. You know, I could remove water from the plant and not water anymore and see how it grew. I think we kind of know how that could go. I could put it in a chamber that had no carbon dioxide and just see if it was just in oxygen, then how would it grow then? And I could test out my explanation that way. And so we're going to use this one sentence explanation in order to test out our hypothesis, our explanations, and see if we are right and learn more about the system. And so as you're designing your explanations, remember the three parts of a good explanation is: number one, identify a scientific cause; number two, identify the components of the system; and number three, use the connections between the components to explain, describe, and predict about the system. And then we can use these explanations in our experiments, and we can test them out and see, are we on the right track? Is this correct, or do we have to adjust our system model just a little bit? So I hope that you're able to understand how to make a scientific explanation, and good luck with that work.